Welcome back to Superbly Said Advanced English Vocabulary and Phrases.
Glad to be here.
Have you ever used an idiom in a really high-stakes professional setting thinking it meant one thing, only to realize you accidentally insulted your entire executive team?
Oh, that is the worst feeling.
Right. It's terrifying because the difference between a simple misunderstanding and some of the advanced vocabulary we are looking at today could honestly, quite literally, cost you your job.
Yeah, the stakes are surprisingly high when you get to this level of fluency.
Exactly. So today, our deep dive is pulled straight from a really brilliant SpeakDuo lesson. Specifically, we are looking at SpeakDuo 1665, which features actors Michael B. Jordan and Jesse Plemons having this just fantastic actors-on-actors conversation.
It is such an absolute goldmine for natural, high-level English.
It really is.
Like when you get two professionals at the absolute top of their game talking about the pressures of their industry, the language they reach for is incredibly dynamic. It's raw, it's precise, and it is packed with these subtle implications.
Yeah. And before we get into the weeds here, for those of you listening who are actively trying to level up your language skills, you can actually head over to SpeakDuo.com to meet new people from around the world.
It's a great platform.
It is. You practice English on video calls, which is just a fantastic way to become more confident with your speaking abilities in real time.
It really is, because, you can study definitions all day long, but putting these phrases into practice in actual real conversations is the only way the nuances truly stick in your brain.
Well said. And speaking of nuance, our mission for this deep dive is specifically tailored for you, the advanced English learner. We are skipping the basic definitions today.
Right. No flashcards today.
Exactly. We want to know exactly when and why native speakers like Jordan and Plemons choose these specific idioms over simpler words. We want to understand the psychological weight behind the vocabulary.
Which is the true mark of fluency. I mean, we aren't just translating words, we are translating intent. So I'm ready to dissect the language if you are.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with a concept that came up organically when these actors were discussing the sheer rejection they face in Hollywood. It's the phrase, thick-skinned.
Ah, yes. A classic.
Right. So the textbook definition here is being able to handle criticism or rejection without being personally affected. But let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
Isn't telling someone to be thick-skinned just a polite way of saying they are arrogant? Or that they just refuse to listen to anyone else?
That is exactly the distinction we need to clarify, because a lot of advanced learners confuse being thick-skinned with being stubborn.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, psychologically, they are fundamental opposites. Being stubborn means you simply refuse to change your mind. You build a brick wall, and the feedback just bounces right off of it.
Right, you essentially just close your ears.
Precisely. You reject the information entirely. But being thick-skinned means you do accept the critical feedback. Think of Michael B. Jordan getting a brutal note from a director on set. He takes that note in, he processes the criticism, and he actively uses it to change his performance. And this is the key here, he does it without letting that criticism emotionally destroy him.
I see.
The metaphorical thick skin protects his ego and his self-worth, not his ability to learn.
Ah, I love that. It's like developing a physical callus on your hands from working with heavy tools.
Exactly.
You still feel the hammer you're holding, you still have a grip on reality, but the friction doesn't cause you agonizing pain anymore.
That is a perfect analogy. You've adapted to the friction.
Let's contextualize this for an IELTS speaking prompt. Maybe if you are asked about working in a creative or highly critical job, you could say, working in such a competitive creative industry requires you to be thick-skinned, as critical feedback is an inevitable part of the process.
And an examiner hearing that immediately knows you understand the emotional resilience required, not just the basic vocabulary.
Yeah, exactly. Now, that leads us down an interesting path. A callus protects you from friction, sure. But what happens when the pressure isn't just a critique?
Right, when it's more than just words.
Yeah, like, what if the physical or mental workload is completely crushing and the thick skin just isn't enough? That brings us to our second phrase, couldn't hack it.
That's a heavy one.
It is. This usually describes being unable to cope with something too demanding. But I have a problem with this one too. Why do we need this phrase? Why not just say, he gave up?
What's fascinating here is how often those two concepts are conflated, when linguistically they tell entirely different stories.
Yeah.
Giving up is a conscious, active choice.
Okay.
It implies you still have fuel left in your tank, but you made a rational decision that the reward simply wasn't worth the effort. You walked away on your own terms.
You looked at the mountain and said, nope, going home.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when you say someone couldn't hack it, it completely removes the element of choice. It implies a fundamental lack of capacity.
So they didn't choose to stop, they just couldn't keep going.
Right, the environment was simply too intense, the pressure was too high, and their internal system completely overloaded. Think about Jesse Plemons talking about those grueling 16-hour shooting schedules in the freezing rain. If a crew member couldn't hack it, it means their body or mind essentially gave out. It's a survival failure, not a casual resignation.
Wow, so there is a real grittiness to it. It's almost a little ruthless, honestly.
Very much so.
A great work-related example of this would be many recruits quit within the first week of the high-intensity training, admitting that they simply couldn't hack it under that level of pressure.
Yeah, that's perfect.
It really paints a picture of people hitting their absolute biological limits.
It does. It implies the environment broke them, rather than them choosing to leave the environment.
So when you hit that limit, or when you face a major rejection, like losing out on a career-defining movie role, you have to process that reality. And that is where our third phrase comes in, tough pill to swallow.
Yes.
This means something very difficult to accept. But again, I'm going to challenge this. Why the elaborate medicine metaphor? Doesn't this just mean you received bad news?
Well, they often trigger one another, but they function in completely different realms. Bad news is external. It is just sterile information being delivered to your ears.
Okay.
A tough pill to swallow, however, is the deeply personal internal process that happens after the bad news is delivered.
Ah, so it's the psychological digestion.
Beautifully put.
Yeah.
Yes. It represents a new, painful reality that you are forced to eventually internalize.
Right, like actual medicine.
It's like swallowing bitter, chalky medicine when you are sick. You don't want to take it. You might gag on it. Your body might physically reject it at first. But eventually, for your own good, it has to go down.
You can almost feel that in the back of your throat. It implies a massive internal struggle before the acceptance.
It's a very visceral phrase.
A highly relatable workplace scenario for this would be being passed over for the leadership role after years of loyal service was a tough pill to swallow, but I eventually accepted the decision and moved on.
Notice how the action in that sentence is the eventual acceptance. The tough pill perfectly encapsulates the painful journey it took to get there.
Okay, let's pivot the narrative a bit. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, where are we going?
Well, we've been talking about internal limits, right? Endurance, acceptance. What happens when the adversity isn't your own endurance, but rather the fact that the people and systems around you are completely failing?
Oh, that's a whole different level of stress.
Exactly. Let's talk about navigating chaos. Our next phrase is fall on deaf ears, which means to be completely ignored. But wait, if I warn a director that a stunt looks dangerous and nothing changes, didn't we just have a misunderstanding?
This is perhaps the most crucial nuance for an advanced speaker to master, especially in a corporate setting. Because if you use this phrase incorrectly, you could cause a massive conflict.
Really? How so?
Well, being misunderstood implies innocence. The other person actually tried to listen to you, but their brain didn't put the pieces together correctly.
So it's just a completely honest mistake, no harm intended.
Exactly. But if you say your message fell on deaf ears, there is zero innocence.
Oh.
It means the recipient understood your words perfectly well, but they actively and deliberately chose to ignore you. They essentially turned their ears off to your concerns.
That's intense.
It is. It implies a high level of negligence, arrogance, or deliberate dismissal.
Oh man, so if I write in a company email that my warnings fell on deaf ears, I am essentially pointing a finger and accusing management of negligence.
100%. It is a highly accusatory idiom.
That is vital to know. Here is a great example of that corporate hazard in action. Despite my repeated warnings about the faulty wiring in the server room, my concerns continued to fall on deaf ears until the fire alarm went off.
See, in that scenario, you aren't saying management lacked the vocabulary to understand the words faulty wiring.
Right, they understood English just fine.
Exactly. You were officially stating that they chose not to care until it was too late.
Right, and when that metaphorical or literal fire alarm goes off, the spotlight immediately swings to leadership.
It always does.
Which brings us to keep it together. The definition is to maintain composure despite chaos. But tell me, how is keeping it together any different than just staying calm?
If you describe someone as staying calm, it implies a natural, genuine state of peace. Their heart rate is low, their breathing is steady. Think of a monk meditating in a quiet garden.
Okay, totally zen.
Yes. But keeping it together is incredibly dynamic. It implies an active, ongoing, almost violent internal struggle to mask your panic.
That's a facade.
In a way, yeah. You are literally trying to hold the fracturing pieces of your psyche together while the environment explodes around you. If you are the lead actor on a movie set that is completely falling apart, you might be terrified inside, but you refuse to let the crew see you sweat.
It's the classic duck on the pond analogy, gliding smoothly on the surface for everyone to see, but underneath the water, those little feet are paddling frantically just to stay afloat.
That is exactly it.
Let's look at an executive example. During the worst of the fiscal crisis, the CEO managed to keep it together, providing the guidance and calm stability the company desperately needed.
And that phrasing acknowledges the massive, exhausting effort required for that CEO to project stability when she was likely panicking on the inside.
So what does this all mean for us? If we are paddling like crazy under the surface, how do we survive without eventually breaking down?
That's the million-dollar question.
Well, you have to manage your space and you have to manage your output. That leads us to tactical boundary setting. Our next phrase is cordon off, which means to separate or isolate an area.
Right.
But let me challenge this. If I want to be left alone, why don't I just say the space is closed?
Because closing something implies a general, often permanent, or at least routine state. A store is closed at night, the door is closed. It's passive.
Okay.
But cordoning off is a highly intentional tactical maneuver. It implies creating a visible, temporary boundary for a very specific high-priority purpose.
Like police tape at a crime scene or those velvet ropes at a Hollywood premiere. It's a physical barrier that screams, do not cross this line right now.
Exactly. Think of Jesse Plemons needing to isolate himself in a corner of a busy set to get into character for a deeply emotional scene. He isn't closing the set.
Right, the set is still working.
Yeah, he is mentally and physically cordoning off that specific space for a critical task.
That makes total sense. A great facilities management example would be to ensure the safety of the conference attendees, we had to cordon off the entire lobby area while the maintenance team repaired the broken ceiling.
You secured the space temporarily to solve a crisis. And you can do the exact same thing abstractly with your time. You can cordon off 2 hours on your Friday calendar specifically for deep, uninterrupted work.
I am absolutely going to start doing that. My calendar is a mess. All right, our final phrase before we test your knowledge is pad it out.
Pad it out, yes.
This means to fill in or add more substance to something thin. If we connect this to the bigger picture of communication, isn't padding something out the exact same thing as elaborating?
Not at all. And the distinction is all about value. When you elaborate on a topic, you are adding genuine depth, nuance, and useful detail. You are strengthening the foundation of the idea.
You are adding real meat to the bones.
Yes. But padding it out carries a slightly negative or highly cynical connotation. It implies you are actively adding filler, or fluff, purely to meet an arbitrary metric.
Oh, I see.
You aren't adding the words because the story needs them. You're adding them because the studio says the movie has to be exactly 90 minutes long.
It's like adding an extra cup of water to a pot of soup just to make sure everyone at the table gets a bowl. It fills the bowl, sure, but it completely weakens the flavor.
That's a great way to look at it.
For an academic or corporate example, you might confess, I had to pad it out with several detailed case studies to ensure my report reached the mandatory 10-page minimum requirement set by the board.
That perfectly captures the essence. Those case studies didn't actually make the argument better, but they were absolutely necessary to hit the page count.
All right, you've heard the nuances, you've explored the Hollywood context. Now it is time for the superbly said quiz. Let's test your ear for these subtle differences. I am going to read a question and 3 possible options. I will announce them as option A, option B, and option C.
And remember, pay close attention to the context in each sentence to see which one actually grasps the psychological weight of the phrase we are testing.
Let's jump in. Question 1. We're looking at the phrase thick-skinned. Which sentence uses the idiomatic phrase thick-skinned correctly based on context? Option A. Working in such a competitive creative industry requires you to be thick-skinned, as critical feedback is an inevitable part of the process. Option B. The professional medical dermatologist was instructed to thick-skin the patient's damaged surface layer. Option C. The deeply frustrated young retail clerk aggressively managed to completely drop a white line. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The correct answer is option A. Thick-skinned in this context means accepting critical feedback without letting it emotionally damage you. It is a state of emotional resilience. It is definitely not a bizarre medical procedure, as option B hilariously suggested.
I don't even want to know what that dermatologist was doing. Question 2. Select the context where the phrase couldn't hack it is most appropriately used figuratively. Option A. The professional computer security expert was instructed to couldn't hack it the encryption layer without the primary key. Option B. The incredibly clumsy warehouse inventory clerk accidentally managed to quickly buy some large systems. Option C. Many recruits quit within the first week of the high-intensity training, admitting that they simply couldn't hack it under that level of pressure. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The answer is option C. Couldn't hack it perfectly describes those recruits whose systems overloaded under intense pressure. Remember, it means lacking the fundamental endurance to survive, not literally failing to hack into a computer system like option A implies.
Right, completely different kind of hacking. Moving on to question 3. In which situation does someone accurately utilize the advanced phrase, tough pill to swallow, contextually? Option A. The professional medical pharmacy technician was instructed to tough pill to swallow the large medication supplement during the clinical trial. Option B. Being passed over for the leadership role after years of loyal service was a tough pill to swallow, but I eventually accepted the decision and moved on. Option C. The completely terrified young wilderness traveler unexpectedly noticed an exceptionally massive heavy tool chest. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
That would be option B. Being passed over for a leadership role is a tough pill to swallow. It represents deeply personal bad news that you are forced to slowly, painfully internalize rather than literally forcing someone to swallow a giant vitamin, like option A.
Yeah, that internal struggle is key. Okay, question 4. Which response best demonstrates the advanced phrase, fall on deaf ears figuratively? Option A. Despite my repeated warnings about the faulty wiring in the server room, my concerns continued to fall on deaf ears until the fire alarm went off. Option B. The professional auditory medical specialist was instructed to fall on deaf ears the patient's request for a hearing aid evaluation. Option C. The incredibly clumsy warehouse inventory clerk accidentally managed to quickly catch that white balance. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The correct choice is option A. Your warnings about the faulty wiring fall on deaf ears when they are actively and negligently ignored by management. Option B treats it like some sort of auditory disease, which misses the point entirely.
Right, the deliberate ignorance is what matters there. Question 5. How would a professional accurately use the phrase, keep it together, contextually? Option A. The professional industrial glue application technician was instructed to keep it together the separate components during the assembly process. Option B. The completely confused amateur theater group unexpectedly decided to proudly paint a clean frame. Option C. During the worst of the fiscal crisis, the CEO managed to keep it together, providing the guidance and calm stability the company desperately needed. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The answer is option C. The CEO managed to keep it together during the crisis. This highlights her active, exhausting struggle to mask internal panic while projecting stability, rather than physically gluing parts together as in option A.
The old duck on the pond. Question 6. Which scenario perfectly illustrates the meaning of the phrase cordon off contextually? Option A. The professional jewelry-making technician was instructed to cordon off the expensive pearls before starting the design. Option B. To ensure the safety of the conference attendees, we had to cordon off the entire lobby area while the maintenance team repaired the broken ceiling. Option C. The incredibly clumsy hotel maintenance worker accidentally managed to completely drop that red tray. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The correct answer is option B. You cordon off the lobby area to create a highly intentional, temporary boundary to manage a crisis safely. You aren't just grouping small pearls on a desk. You are actively securing a space.
Let's bring it home with question 7. Which sentence accurately utilizes the advanced phrase, pad it out, contextually? Option A. I had to pad it out with several detailed case studies to ensure my report reached the mandatory 10-page minimum requirements set by the board. Option B. The professional upholstery repair technician was instructed to pad it out the worn-out sofa chair with extra cotton stuffing. Option C. The deeply confused young kitchen assistant accidentally managed to quickly slice a fresh piece of padding. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The correct option is A. You pad it out with extra case studies strictly to meet that arbitrary 10-page metric. It's about adding fluff, watering down the soup, rather than physically stuffing a sofa like option B suggested.
And that concludes the superbly said quiz. If you caught all those nuances, your grasp of advanced context is truly incredible. We've covered so much psychological ground today, from the grit required to be thick-skinned to the intense duck-on-the-pond effort of keeping it together when your warnings fall on deaf ears.
This raises an important question, though, doesn't it?
Oh, what's that?
Well, what if we started actively cordoning off time in our schedules, not just for work, but specifically to process the tough pills to swallow in our careers, rather than just hoping we are thick-skinned enough to ignore them?
Wow. Now that is a fantastic, provocative thought to leave on. Maybe we all need a little more intentional boundary setting for our own mental resilience, instead of just padding out our days with more work. Thank you all for joining this session, and be sure to take these advanced idioms and the insights behind them into your next English conversation. Until next time.